A very warm welcome everyone to the AOS-CX 10.12,000 update series. I'm Shobana, team for Aruba campus switching. This is yet another episode of 10.12,000 update series. In this episode, I will walk you through the TACACS Plus enhancements introduced in 10.12,000 release of AOS-CX switches. Let's quickly jump into the session. So I'll be covering following sections in this episode: overview, details, use cases, configuration, troubleshooting, and then a small demo. First, let's start with the overview. Here is the overview about TACACS Plus. TACACS Plus, which stands for Terminal Access Controller Access Control Server, is a security protocol used in the AAA framework to provide centralized AAA services for users who wanted to gain access to the network. AAA means authentication, authorization, and accounting. So the remote AAA with TACACS Plus provides the following for AOS-CX switches: authentication using remote TACACS Plus AAA servers, authorization using remote TACACS Plus AAA servers, providing fine-grained command authorization. Optional user-defined local user groups with configured command authorization rules can be used to provide the authorization failback protection when the TACACS Plus servers become temporarily unavailable. Transmission of locally collected accounting information to the remote TACACS Plus servers. The remote AAA with TACACS Plus is supported on all the AOS-CX switches, and it supports both IPv4 and IPv6 TACACS servers. Here is the list of enhancements added in 10.12,000 release as part of TACACS Plus feature. So let's understand one by one in detail section later. In brief, these are the enhancements. Point to be noted as these enhancements are applicable to only switch management user administration, not for the port access authentication. First is TACACS Plus support on VXLAN overlay, both IPv4 and IPv6. And next comes the support for authorization and accounting allow fail-through. Last but not least, we have AAA fallback enablement for key mismatch errors received from TACACS Plus, and also this feature has been extended to Radius server. So with these features, here is the table explaining the platform support matrix. So when you are trying to deploy these features in your customer environment, kindly look into the platform support matrix. Let's look into the details. First comes the TACACS Plus support on VXLAN overlay. So our CX product line code has been updated to now support the ability to leverage TACACS Plus servers, both IPv4 and IPv6 in a VXLAN fabric overlay, both IPv4 and IPv6 with an IPv4 or IPv6 underlay. So in general, these TACACS Plus packets can now traverse over the VXLAN tunnels, and no additional configurations are required for the feature enablement on the CX switches apart from the required TACACS Plus server configuration. So here is a snippet of the packet capture over the VXLAN. So you could see here, this is a TACACS Plus packet, UDP packet with destination port as 4789 specific to the TACACS Plus, and it has been encapsulated over the VXLAN. So you could see the VXLAN header as well with the VNI mapping. So here is the TACACS Plus packet. It is an encrypted packet. So this clearly shows that TACACS Plus can now go via the VXLAN as well. So next comes the support for authorization and accounting allow fail-through. So before that, let's understand what is a fail-through mechanism. So fail-through mechanism for authentication has been available in previous releases as well. So what is the major objective of fail-through? So fail-through allows authentication to proceed to the next authentication method in the list, even if one of the authentication method returned an authentication error. So if there is an authentication error with one method, we will try to do a fail through to the next method. So it is mainly needed in scenarios where the AAA servers are not in sync, and hence the user accounts may be available in all the other servers. So it may fail in the first server but be available in the next server. So as I said earlier, prior to 10.12,000 release, the fail-through mechanism for authorization and accounting is not supported. Only it is available for authentication. So the enhancement in 10.12,000 releases, new CLIs are introduced to enable authorization and accounting allow fail through. The last enhancement is AAA fallback enablement for key mismatch errors received from TACACS Plus and Radius server. So prior to 10-12,000 release, if we are sending some request to the AAA servers like Radius or TACACS server, and if there is a key mismatch between our configuration and the configuration that exists in the TACACS or Radius server, we terminate the session as a AAA failures. But with 10-12,000 release, even if there is a key mismatch error is received from the TACACS and Radius servers, we will fall back with the next configured AAA server in the list or the authentication method in the list. So the reason for this behavior changes, we wanted to be in line with our AOS switches and customer requested for the changes. And for this behavior, there is no additional CLIs required. It is internally handled by the switch. Let's hear about the use cases. First comes the TACACS Plus support on VXLAN overlay. So consider a CX switching hospitality use case where there is a medical building connected to the remote DC. In the remote DC, there will be services, DHCP, DNS, ClearPass, and then there will be application specific to the hospitality vertical. So in this medical building, we'll be using 6300 VSF as access switches and VTEPs, or the 6400 standalone as access switches and VTEPs. And there will be 6400 VSX aggregation switches and 8360 VSX core switches acting as a border VTEPs. So we will be achieving dynamic segmentation with VXLAN. So colorless ports for the medical devices. And once these devices are authenticated, they are placed into the assigned VLAN or VNI. And the distributed L3 gateways at the access VTEPs for the overlaid traffic. And the VSX core switches function as a border VTEPs to connect the VXLAN and then the non-VXLAN networks. So our interest today is AAA. So for the switch management, like the 6300 VSF access switch or the 6400 standalone access switches are integrated with ClearPass TACACS Plus in the remote DC. So they are achievable using the VXLAN fabric overlay. It can be either IPv4 or IPv6. And for the wired devices such as medical equipments connected to the access switches on the 6300 and then the 6400 switches are integrated with ClearPass Radius servers in the remote DC. So this is how the hospitality use case can be secured using TACACS over VXLAN and then the Radius over VXLAN. So the next use case is AAA fallback enablement, that is key mismatch. So consider this configuration where we have three TACACS and then Radius servers A, B and C. They are assigned to the same TACACS and then Radius server group respectively. So I have enabled authentication and authorization of SSH via a TACACS group and then authentication of Telnet using a Radius server group. So consider the switch is trying to access the server A, and because of some configuration mismatch, the key is not same between the server A and then the switch. So this will result in a AAA failures. So how we are going to handle it? So we will try to reach the next AAA server, that is server B in the list. So this is how when there is a shared key mismatch between the TACACS and Radius server, the switch will fall back to the next configure TACACS Plus or Radius server for authentication, authorization and accounting. Next comes the authentication and authorization allow fail-through use case. How the pre-existing authentication allow fail-through can be combined with authorization allow fail-through newly introduced in this release to help us solve some of the use cases. First comes the same AAA method. So let's understand this use case with the configuration. I have enabled authentication and authorization allow fail-through and there is a TACACS server called CPPM TACACS. So the authentication for login method with default parameters is been set to first happen via CPPM TACACS and the next authentication method is local. Similarly, the authorizations for the commands will first happen via CPPM TACACS. If not, it will fall back to the local. So let's consider the use case. The admin It gets authenticated with the TACACS server, CPPM TACACS, with admin privilege and is allowed to execute all commands. Next is IT stuff. It gets authenticated with CPPM TACACS, TACACS server with operator privilege and is allowed to execute only show commands. Now comes the local user. So first, the authentication with happens via the CPPM TACACS. Since the credentials is not present in the CPPM TACACS server, he will fail through to the next authentication method, that is the local. So here through local he will get authenticated successfully. So the next part is authorization. Since the new CLI authorization allow fail through is enabled, so the user authorization will also fail through the next available TACACS server in the list, that is the local server. So using the local credentials and then authorization, the local user can execute all the commands. The next use case is different AAA methods. So consider the configuration where I have enabled authentication and authorization allow fail-through. So I have a CPPM TACACS server group and CPPM radius and then the radius server group. For SSH login authentication, the first authentication method I have configured as CPPM TACACS and the next method is CPPM radius. And for command authorization, I have configured the first authorization method as local and the second authorization method as CPPM TACACS. Consider a user admin. So his authentication credentials only exist in the radius server. So he will go for a fail through because the authentication first method is CPPM TACACS. Since the credential will not be available in TACACS server, he will fail through the next authentication method, that is radius. And he will be allowed to execute all commands with local authorization with privilege received from the radius server. Next comes the IT staff. So he gets authenticated with TACACS server because his credentials relies in the TACACS server, and he is allowed to execute only those show commands using the authorization from the TACACS server with authorization fail through. The reason being is the authorization first method is local. Since the credential is not present in the local, it will go to the next authorization method, that is CPPM TACACS. Last, we have the local user. So he gets authenticated with the local authentication. But here it is a fail through because the authentication configuration order is first CPPM TACACS and then CPPM radius. And local user is only present in the local authentication method. And by default, the last authentication method is local. Hence, the user gets authenticated via local credentials in the switch, and the user gets authorized as well locally and is allowed to execute all the commands. At last, we have the local user and he wanted to do a console operation on the switch, and he gets authenticated with local authentication as the authentication method is not configured for the console. But the user gets authorized locally as we have authorization enabled, and the first method is local only, and he is allowed to execute all the commands. The last one is different servers. So consider the configuration where we have enabled authentication authorization fail through, and there is two different servers. The first server group is a TACACS server, CPPM TACACS, and next server group is the EXT TACACS. So we have enabled the authentication login with default parameters with group first authentication method as CPPM TACACS and next authentication method as the EXT TACACS. Similarly, for authorization, the first authorization method is CPPM TACACS and next authorization method is EXT TACACS. So consider a user admin. He gets authenticated with CPPM TACACS and with admin privilege, and he is allowed to execute all commands. Next comes the IT staff. So he also gets authenticated with CPPM TACACS and is allowed to execute only those show commands using authorization from the TACACS server, CPPM TACACS. So next comes the security user. He gets authentication reject with the CPPM TACACS server because his credentials does not exist in that TACACS server, and he gets authenticated with the next authenticated method, that is the EXT TACACS plus server, so with the fail through mechanism, and he is allowed to execute the restricted set of security commands only with the EXT TACACS plus server upon authorization fail through. So these are the sample use cases for authentication and authorization allow fail-through. So for this authentication and allow fail-through, we can come up with different use cases based on the need of the customer. Next comes the configuration section. So we do have new CLIs only for the authorization and accounting allow fail-through feature. For rest of the features, there is no new CLIs available. They are implicitly covered by the switch. So to enable or disable the authorization and accounting fail-through, here is the new CLIs. AAA authorization allow fail-through, AAA accounting allow fail-through. So how easily we can identify whether these configurations are enabled or not in the switch? You can do a show run and then grep it with allow fail-through. So next comes the support for authorization accounting allow fail-through through REST API. So we can do that using the system context as these are global CLIs. So we have accounting fail-through, authorization fail-through, and then the basic fail-through that is for the authentication. So next comes the troubleshooting part. First, let's start with the show commands. So here is the show commands to help us identify the authorization and accounting allow fail-through. First, let's start with the show AAA authentication. It will show whether the authentication fail-through is enabled or not. Similarly, show AAA authorization whether the authorization fail-through is enabled or not. And show AAA accounting to help us identify whether accounting fail-through is enabled or not. So next comes the REST API get method to identify the allow fail-through configurations. We can do a get of system context to identify the allow fail-through sub-options. Next comes the diagnostics. So we can use the diagdump AAA basic to debug any issues with respect to the AAA module. So we do not have any debug specific for the AAA module as we have diagdump AAA basic. So you can use this diagdump AAA basic to identify the issue with respect to the AAA. Let's jump into the demo section. So in this demo, I'll be showcasing three features: TACACS plus support on VXLAN overlay using IPv4 overlay and IPv4 underlay, authentication and authorization fail through, and then key mismatch. So for this demo, I'll be using a three-layer topology where the access switch is connected to the aggregation to the core. So there will be VXLAN tunnel formed between the access VTUPs, and there will be a VXLAN tunnel formed between the access to the core VTUP, that is the border VTUP. So if you could see here, this is a snippet of the two interface VXLAN output from the core switch. So there are two VXLAN tunnels, one with the access VTUP 1 and other with the access VTUP 2. And if you could see the access VTUP 1, there will be two VXLAN tunnel, one with the access VTUP 2 and one with the border VTUP in the core. So the TACACS server will be connected over the core VTUP, that is the border VTUP. So here is the configuration I'll be using for this demo. So the foremost, I have configured the TACACS server, and then I have enabled authentication, authorization, and accounting allow fail through. So I'll be using SSH for this feature. So I have enabled authentication of SSH using TACACS and authorization of SSH using TACACS as well. And these are the VXLAN related basic configurations. And additionally, I wanted the packets to go via the VXLAN. Hence, I am using the IP source interface TACACS and interface as VLAN 101, where the VLAN 101 is mapped the VNA in the VXLAN context. And you can use the show TACACS server statistics to verify the TACACS request response between the switch and then the TACACS server. So here is the configuration I'll be using in the TACACS server. I have created a user called TACadmin with the privilege level as 15. The user can access any authorization commands. In brief, for the TACACS plus support on VXLAN overlay, there will be a VXLAN tunnel formed between the access to the border VTUP, and the TACACS plus packets will be traversing over this VXLAN tunnel. So I have opened four terminal windows here. One is the core border VTUP, other one is the access VTUP, and next is the TACACS server. I'll be using a Linux-based TACACS server, and next is the management client connected to the switch. From that management client, I'll be doing SSH to the switch. So first let's verify the VXLAN connectivity. So we'll check in the border VTUP, show interface VXLAN. So the VTUPs are the access VTUPs. So both the VTUPs are in operational state. So let's check the run interface VXLAN. We'll see in which VLAN the VTUPs are operational. They are operation in VLAN 101. So the TACACS server is also in 101 network. It is 101.1.1.10. So it is reachable. So let's see the interface configuration of TACACS server connected port. It is VLAN access 101. So now let's go to the access VTUP and check the VXLAN connectivity. So first we'll see show interface VXLAN. So it clearly shows there are two VTUPs. One is the border VTUP, other one is the access VTUP 2. And whether the VTUPs are operational or not, they are operational. Let's check the show run interface VXLAN. So VLAN 101 is the where the VXLAN tunnel is operational now. So let's check the show TACACS server detail. It will clearly show which is the TACACS server configured. It is in VLAN 101. So let's try to ping the TACACS server first. So the TACACS server is reachable. So now let's see what is the other configuration enabled. I have enabled IP source interface TACACS as interface VLAN 101. As I said earlier, I have created a local user called local admin and then enable TACACS server configuration, authorization and authentication allow fail through, and I'm trying to do the login authentication for SSH and command authorization as well with the TACACS server as the first authentication method and local as the second authentication method. So here is the TACACS server configuration. I have created a user called TACadmin with privilege level 15 and the user is authorized to execute all the commands. So now let me go to the management client and check the connectivity. So this management client is connected to the switch access VTUP 1 and from this management client I'll be doing SSH to the access VTUP 1. Let me identify the access VTUP 1's IP address for the management connectivity. The access VTUP 1 management VLAN is 201. So the IP is 201.1.1.2. So I am doing SSH to that using TACadmin. So now TACACS authorization and authentication is successful. So you could see the authorization is also happening now. So this TACACS requests are sent over VXLAN tunnel to the border VTUP and from the border VTUP they have been decapsulated and then been sent to the TACACS server. So you can issue a diagram AAA basic to identify the details about the authentication here. So it clearly shows the user authentication is successful with the user TACadmin from the TACACS server. So with that, we have come to the end of the TACACS Plus support over VXLAN feature. Let me go to the other feature now. So let's see the next feature, key mismatch. So for that purpose, I'll be going to the TACACS server configuration and then modifying the secret key. So I'm trying to change the key. The configuration in the switch remains the same, only in the TACACS server I'm modifying the key configuration. Let me restart the TACACS server. So with that now let me try to do a authentication testing. So we'll go to the management client. So I'll be using the local admin credentials here. So before that, let me try with the TACadmin. This TACadmin credential is not present in the switch, so the authentication will not be succeeded. So the first authentication method is TACACS and then the second authentication method is local. So switch will be failing over to the next authentication method local, but this credential is not present in the local switch. So that's the reason the authentication has failed. And even in the logs, we can see the main reason for the TACACS failure is the key mismatch, incorrect key. So let me try it out with the local admin credentials now, that credential that exists in the switch. So with the local admin credentials, you can clearly see the authentication and authorization will be successful because switch will be falling back to the second method of authentication or authorization, that is local. So even though the first authentication authorization method TACACS is not working, reason as the key mismatch, which is able to fall back to the next authentication method and then the authorization method. So it is clearly visible in the diagram output as well. So now let's see the last but not least, the authentication authorization allow fail through feature. So let me go to the switch and then check the configuration first. So we'll do show run and grepping with AAA. You could identify have enabled AAA authentication logging SSH as group TACACS first authentication method, local is a second, and allow fail through is also enabled. So we'll go to the management client again. First, let me try it out with the correct key configuration. So I'm modifying the key back to the normal state and restarting the TACACS server. So now we'll try with the local admin credentials. So the local admin credential is not present in the TACACS server. Since now the TACACS server is reachable and working fine, this should not be working. But why do we see it? Reason being is authentication and authorization allow fail through. So even though there is a failure from the first authentication or authorization method TACACS, we could successfully fall back to the next authentication authorization method, that is local. So that's how this local admin able to have access using the local credentials in the switch and then authorization as well. So this clearly shows that authentication and authorization fail through is working fine. So you can check in show run as well. It will show both the authentication and authorization allow fail through CLIs are enabled. Thank you everyone for watching this video. If you have any further queries with respect to this feature, kindly reach out to us in our ADETS community. Thank you everyone. Bye.